So one time, let's say I was in my mid 30s, I was walking down the street in Norman, Oklahoma, and out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of this big front window of a Western wear store. Now, in that window was a real bobcat, stuffed, mounted, and about to prowl among the shirts and belt buckles at the foot of a full grown golden palomino, stuffed, mounted, its right hoof raised as if it were suddenly hesitant. I mean, suspended between, thought and action, or past and present, fixed, eternal, and looking a little surprised at how things had turned out. But all of that eternity in that window was just child's play, at least compared to this little town out in eastern Oklahoma where I do have some relatives. Now that town had a mortician whose work was so fine, it wasn't entirely unheard of for an occasional client to continue on about their business for some time after their death, right? Well, much to the family's consternation, as you might imagine. I mean, one time, my Uncle George got up one morning, like he would every morning, to pull himself together and walk downtown to open his hardware store, which was on Front Street. But that morning, he turned in the door of his house to speak with his wife and just fell down. Catch in his heart, surprised look on his face, and the next thing he knew, he was staring up at the ceiling of Foster's funeral chapel and thinking to himself, there has got to be some kind of mistake here. Now, my Aunt Martha sent him to Foster's because, Foster's was the Democratic funeral home there in town. No, it would not do to send a member of the county Democratic committee to the Republican funeral home, which was a couple of blocks down, any more than it would do to, lay out a Baptist at the Methodist church. And so George found himself in a good suit, lying in some of the finest cabinetry in that whole part of the county, staring up at the ceiling of Foster's funeral chapel and thinking to himself, I have not got time for this. Now, I know what you're thinking, but Mr. Foster was not unaware, nor was he unsympathetic. And this would happen from time to time because of his pride in his work, I guess. He would sit down with the nearly deceased, and he would explain the circumstances and the complications. And usually they would see reason and lie back down and pass on over. But George was, distracted. Well, first he kept seeing his wife's face. I mean, he knew she was a strong woman, but he knew this was going to be hard. Fortunately, two older kids were married and off on their own, but Neva, their youngest, had just finished high school. They had no idea how they could possibly pay for college. He's only halfway through the mid-season paint inventory, and things were just so unfinished. While Brady Foster droned on and on about unchanging eternity. Now, George had tried to be polite. I mean, he sat up there in the coffin, fished around for that little sateen pillow, stuck it behind him so the box wouldn't cut into him, looked Foster in the eye so he'd know he was paying attention. And then George noticed that Foster's always had that sharp, uncomfortable smell of, memorial baskets, he guessed, which reminded him when his own mother had passed and all of the things they'd had to do then. And now he knew his own family was going to get doing that, not to mention reading that damn book about all the various stages of grief, And George realized that if he was any of those stages right now, it was probably the stage when you were just pissed off. And so he thanked Mr. Foster for his concern, hoped to see him at the chamber meeting on Thursday, and then got up and walked downtown to open the hardware store. Now, out on the street, George noticed that the town just, well, it wasn't quite in focus. And then he realized that what he was seeing were two towns, right? Not quite superimposed. Now, the town in front, he recognized immediately, the town he walked through every day. But the town in back, he recognized that from his father's stories, right? I mean, always changing depending on what story the old guy was telling him. But in that luminous space between the two, where the living and the dead walked together. Now, okay, let's see. George fell down in his doorway Monday morning pretty early, which would make this, early Tuesday morning when Brady Foster had come in to prepare him for the viewing. Well, the viewing started when Betty, who ran the beauty parlor with her partner Susan, which is like right across the street from the hardware store, when Betty looked out their front window that morning, and there was George sweeping his sidewalk like he did every day. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Brady Foster takes entirely too much pride in his work. Susan left off working on Mrs. McDonald there in the first chair, walked up behind Betty, went, "Oh boy, Brady Foster made my mama look so real that, well, it was almost like having her back again." But she did not show up at bingo the following Wednesday. And so while Susan walked back to make sure all her customers had very engrossing magazines, Betty walked over the reception counter and called my Aunt Martha. Now, all of the rest of the early birds that day, they saw George sweeping his sidewalk, and since they were not quite used to him not being there, they greeted him carefully and then went on about their business. But Mrs. Tays, who ran the Hallmark shop, which is a couple of doors down, she ran up and she hugged George so hard and so quick, and then just ran away back to her shop. And standing there at her counter, she told herself that it was not that she did not love her own husband. It's just that she had always loved the way that George smelled. It reminded her of high school, where she had had such a crush on him that she had to be careful how she thought of him there in senior English, because then she would blush up and every one of her girlfriends would know that she wasn't thinking about composition. And now she just stood there among the sympathy card racks, hugging herself and wondering what to do with all of these sudden memories. And George, he was so taken aback that he leaned the broom there against the front window and walked back into the store to get himself some coffee. But on the way to the back room, smell just didn't call to him like, it usually would. In fact, the smell itself just seemed to be, I don't know, fading into the distance. Now, George, he did finish the paid inventory in time to take a late lunch. And he walked through those two towns down toward the drugstore. Now, everybody that he passed along the way whispered to each other that that is the best he has looked in years. I don't know what it is. Maybe, well, less stress. No, and he doesn't have to worry about school politics anymore. Yeah, that's got to be it. But they didn't actually talk to George much. And when he got back down to the drugstore and was on his way over to the lunch counter, he noticed again that the living and the dead mingled. Well, I mean, they did not greet each other, or they did not bump elbows over tuna fish sandwiches there at the counter. It was layered worlds with no immediate interaction. But from time to time, one of the living might brush up against a long dead friend or relative, and they would start as if they had just remembered something hard, or a flash of joy. And they would shake themselves and go on about their business. Now, my Aunt Martha heard about all of this before the morning was even out, and she just could not bring herself to leave the house. She told Neva she just felt ripped apart, like someone had taken this big knife to her belly, like in one of those old Harry Carey scenes in the old movies, just ripped apart first because she had lost him, and then, well, ripped apart again because she could not stop remembering. And Neva, she did not help. I mean, she was crying, but she was also flinging herself around and just calling out. I mean, it was a whole lot like her big final scene at the senior play there in the spring, where she had had to fall down, but then she had accidentally rolled off that first platform and then pretended like she had intended to do that, just like every cat you had ever owned. And then out in the audience, George and Martha first laughed behind their hands, and then they kind of squirmed in embarrassment and wondered whether all of those elective speech and drama courses had been a good investment of time. But Martha remembered that, driving home that night with Neva asleep in the back seat, they they had agreed that yes, it was worth it because Neva just seemed to enjoy suffering in public. So although Martha didn't know how it would lead to a full-time job, but now, she just grabbed a hold of Neva to make her stay still and just wished that George could be here to see what was going to happen next. Now, all of the neighbors came and went late morning, early afternoon, bringing condolences and, of course, hot dishes. And Mrs. Wilson brought her legendary tuna fish casserole, and she told Martha how, well, she could testify that it was hard. Oh, she sure could. And she knew particularly how hard it could be when it was sudden, like, and of course, then, well, and she couldn't think of anything else to say. So Martha thanked her and took the casserole and put it with all the rest of the hot dishes. And Brady Foster came by to apologize. Martha said, "What were you thinking?" And Brady bridled up the way he always would, saying, he had he just could not do anything less than his best work. And he couldn't, in all conscience, suggest that Rocky Thompson down the street, because Republicans only thought of the next quarter, and they did not consider craft or the big picture. My big picture has finished the paint inventory and will be home for supper. And Brady just wilted. And Betty and Susan let him off rather quickly with that piece of date nut bread, which they knew from other funerals was his favorite. Now, let's see. I guess the neighbors had all filtered away early mid-afternoon, so that Martha and Neva were not by themselves for too long before the two older kids and their families got there around 5:30 or so, and Martha stood there in the front hall while they just swirled around her like dandelion seeds. And while they were all taking turns hitting the bathrooms, Carol, who is Bobby's wife, she was trying to hold on to Martha and her youngest Sean just so hard until finally Sean stopped squirming, although he was looking a little bug-eyed. So Martha took him so he could breathe again. And they really hadn't gotten very far in figuring out what to do about the situation when there was George walking up the sidewalk. And then they moved, but it was like they were moving in slow motion. It was like their lives were underwater. I mean, they just could not get away or get back fast enough. And then there was George, standing among them, smiling to see everyone at the house. Now, Bobby, who, he was Carol's husband, you remember, and he's also Martha and George's eldest, and it's a role he had always taken seriously, at least, after he had finally grown up. He'd taken his dad to one side to ask him, if he didn't think it was, better for the family, if it wasn't more responsible. I mean, in that there is no miracle, and that you can't just be betwixt and between. And he couldn't believe that maybe he was asking his dad to finish dying, and he just got caught up in every angry word they had ever said to each other, because he could never talk to his dad at all. And then there was George with that little crooked smile on his face that he always got in situations like this. And that reminded Bobby of his first summer after his first year in college, when he had told his dad that the town was too small, the people were too narrow, and the hardware store was a trap. And George's little sideways smile had tightened around the edges, and he had nodded. I mean, like he agreed or something. Bobby knew that had to be a trick. He just could, and then he admits it. He had stepped over the line, and he had demanded to know that if George didn't think the hardware store was a trap, and George had just gone. And Bobby couldn't breathe. I mean, his dad had just flipped him off. I mean, in that nice way that your buddies would flip you off if you stepped over the line with them. But well, his dad had just shot him the bone. He remembered thinking, God, I must be finally grown up. Now, George wasn't really interested in supper, though he did sit there to make conversation. Everybody else in the family kind of picked at the hot dishes. And then while they were stacking the dishes in the sink, George walked out onto the front porch to sit a while instead of coming to bed, which was a relief to my aunt. I mean, it's not that she did not love him so hard it hurt. And they had always had a healthy relationship, but she just did not know what she was going to do now that her husband was dead. Well, and sitting on the front porch. And so she pulled the coverlet around her and sat there on the edge of the bed and shivered till almost dawn. And then she got to worrying about George. So she fished around till she could find an Afghan and took it out onto the front porch. And there he was. He's sitting on the swing. And she draped the Afghan over his shoulders, sat down beside him, didn't say anything for a good long while. And then wrapped up in the smell of the wisteria like they were, she asked him if he didn't remember just all the times that they had done this. And then, oh, hun, we planned for this. Martha told me that George glanced over at her, and then he reached out to pat her knee like he would and said, "You know, hun, it's just something about being dead that affects your memory. I am just beginning to notice it. I mean, it's not that you can't remember it all, but I don't know. I think maybe that all the bits of love and hate that hold it all together, I think those begin to fall away, right? So you're just not always sure how you feel about it anymore." Whew. How long does that take? Oh, babe, I'm still working on my mom and dad. And right then, George looked up, and there was his father. I mean, dead a good 30 years, walking down the street in front of the house, obviously heading down to open up the hardware store. George stood up. The old Afghan slipped into Martha's lap, and then he leaped over the porch railing as if he were suddenly a much younger man. And Martha said that he dashed out into the street, fell into step with his dad, hadn't gone a couple of houses before he was waving his hands around on his head like they did when they were in one of their discussions. And then right at the corner where they would turn to go downtown, George stopped and looked back at her. I mean, as if he were suddenly hesitant, maybe suspended between thought and action, surely between past and present, but not fixed and eternal. With each step, he was first the young man that she'd met, and then, well, her lover and her husband and father. Not fixed and eternal, but changing every time some other memory popped into her head. And then he turned and he walked away with his dad. And Martha knew that she was not going to get any sleep. And so she stood there for the longest time, trying to remember how many cans of orange juice she had out in the garage freezer and which one of the hot dishes, or maybe two, she would heat up for everybody's breakfast. And as she stood there in that pearl gray light, and it began to be shot through with bits of color, over her shoulder, she could hear the sounds of her home rising around her in the dawn. That's right.